Chapter 9. Mr. Simmons. Antigua, Guatemala. He paused for a moment under the large stone arch at the edge of the square and turned to make sure he wasn't being followed. There were 3 dirty kids a little ways down and a couple of backpackers heading back to their place from Café Noce, a hip night spot with good music and better mezcal. The kids were skipping away from him into the warren of streets which led away from the square with its dominating cathedral and late-night taco stands. Simmons was hungry, and he'd visited the square's vendors at night before without incident. He has always assumed that, if trouble came, it would be a quick pistol to the temple on a darkened street, or that he'd simply wake up dead in his hotel after a one-sided encounter with a silenced .45. "Extra beans, extra chili sauce," he explained in English to the vendor, who stood near the corner opposite the cathedral, which was quiet on this Wednesday night. The town was almost deserted, in fact, by 1 a.m., and as the bars closed, it took on a semblance of the open-air museum it truly was. A World Heritage Site, a comparatively safe haven in this impoverished and violent country, and Roy Simmons' bolt hole for the 3 weeks since his administrative suspension from Marble Street and Bank. He'd taken a room in an anonymous little apartment just behind one of the small city's side streets, a few blocks from the square, and virtually in the shadow of Agua, the volcano which dominated the skyline. There were shops nearby, an internet cafe, and enough quiet restaurants and street vendors that Simmons hadn't needed to learn how to cook, which was a bonus because the battered leaky stove in his cheap temporary home looked like a bomb waiting to go off. He hunkered down for most of the day, glued to his computer, answering queries and appearing in more than a dozen web interviews so far. He was the latter-day Edward Snowden, some had said, an insider who had fled because he couldn't take it anymore and was now desperate for the world to know the truth. Or, perhaps more accurately, he'd fled out of fear for his life, having carelessly left the door open for a consummate, genre-defining hack and the severe embarrassment and, in some cases, imprisonment of dozens of the bank's longest-standing customers. He knew which was true, but played the part as though he had nothing to lose, which, at this stage, if he were honest, he didn't. Simmons brought the tacos back to his place and fired up his laptop again, bouncing the signal through a network of servers as usual. So far, there was no indication that anyone truly knew where he was. He left hints that he'd taken refuge in Hong Kong, a la Snowden, or that he was braving the chaos of Syria to hide amid its ruins. In truth, he'd come to Guatemala the very evening after the hack. He'd chosen, rather impetuously for a man of such calm reason and logic, to resign at once and forfeit his stock options rather than go through some protracted legal quagmire, only to find at the end that he was, indeed, responsible for the hack and deserved everything he got. He tried not to think about it. The failure was his, but no group would have wasted weeks on an elaborate hack if the bank hadn't so richly deserved a public and lasting punishment. This was the point he repeatedly made during the web interviews, and would make this evening when he met up with a small team from CNN, who had promised fair treatment and the opportunity to tell his side of the story. Simmons ate slowly and mindfully. Food was one of the few pleasures he could permit himself at present. When the tacos were gone, he brought out a yellow legal pad and made a list of the questions he expected CNN to ask. Simmons felt a determination not to miss his chance to publicly define his role in the hack and to present himself as a believable and much maligned character. He hoped his girlfriend Millie was watching. A half-dozen emails had been all that he could risk, and from her replies, Simmons could tell she was going out of her mind. The media coverage didn't help. A documentary team to whom he'd given a couple of early interviews went on to produce the hyped-up web documentary The Man Who Broke the Bank, which both blamed Simmons for the hack and attacked the public for their unwillingness to change their passwords, install antivirus software, and take seriously the looming threat of data theft. They turned a hack into a public health problem, and the documentary's impact was already causing a boom in personal digital protection systems and more secure ways of communicating. CNN had rented another room in a nearby hotel so that they could set up their lights and cameras in advance. They were surprisingly discreet for what was normally a splashy, noisy channel, and Simmons found himself sitting quietly opposite Lance Rogers, an up-and-coming anchor whose interview with Bashar al-Assad made him an overnight sensation. He also had the looks to succeed as a network news anchor, and was rumored to be dating a supermodel. Simmons could believe it, and felt slightly in awe of the interviewer, but he put the sensation aside. He was the story, after all, and the world would soon better understand what he had done and not done. Makeup was briskly completed, sound checks were made, and they could begin. "Roy Simmons," Lance began, looking immaculate in a dark blue suit. "There's been a whole heck of a lot written about you in the last few weeks, that you're responsible for the virtual meltdown of an established New York bank, that you fled abroad because you're afraid for your safety, that you're unable to return to the U.S., Lance exaggerated, and that your family has no idea where you are." There didn't seem to be a question coming, so Simmons simply smiled. "It's been pretty strange reading about myself, especially when a lot of it has been so richly inventive." Lance liked this as an opener, and laughed easily. "It must be like finding yourself as the hero of a mystery novel, perhaps." Simmons replied, "True, although you'd be surprised what a little anonymity and remoteness can do. I'm pretty well insulated from the craziness." He was determined to begin with some humanizing comments. Technical people were often portrayed as indistinguishable from their machines when it came to personality and sense of humor. Simmons wasn't just a geek who worked for a bank. He was an eyewitness to one of the most seminal moments in computing history. "I'd like to begin with the hack itself. When did you learn that something was wrong?" Simmons related the events in what he thought was just enough detail. "They emulated my security credentials, so it looked like I was logging in, and then they were very smart about discovering and using one of the few vulnerabilities in our system. He didn't want any other hacker collectives to have any new information with which they might replicate the MSB hack. No other security analysts would be forced into hiding on his account. The fact was that he'd been bested by a program which went on to become the world's first true artificial intelligence, and therefore needed harbor no resentment. It could have happened to any company, but the hackers chose MSB." "Why do you think Marble Streatham in particular became a target?" Lance asked next. "Because of its record," Simmons replied, as directly as he had since he'd left the bank. "You can't flaunt international and local laws with quite that level of arrogant impunity and expect never to be brought to account." "So you believe that MSB had it coming?" Lance asked. "Yes, there's no doubt in my mind," Simmons responded, shaking his head. "They were among the world's dirtiest major banks. What the hackers did was a meaningful public service. Even if their actions ended up costing me my career, my livelihood, and my freedom of movement, I can see that such an attack was both warranted and inevitable." Rogers moved on to questions about Simmons' existence since the hack. "I'm sure that you miss your family very much." "I do, and I want to reiterate this. They have no idea where I am, and so there's no use in asking them. I've made sure they're out of town for a few weeks," he said. Rogers leaned in and asked quietly, "Do you believe their lives might be in danger?" Simmons took a deep breath. "Lance, we're dealing with some pretty serious, pretty angry people. They were badly embarrassed by the hack. Many will do serious jail time, and they're likely to want to lash out at someone. I'm kind of the only target they have," he explained. "The people who perpetrated this hack are nowhere to be found, and with good reason. They'd be hunted down by private security firms and either co-opted to write malicious code or simply murdered." In Queens, Fiona hugged her knees as she sat in her swivel chair. "Great news," she muttered darkly. "So, they direct their anger at me," Simmons explained. "But it was the bank's own policies and behavior that were the real problem, the true cause of this whole mess." "What kind of threats did you receive?" Rogers asked. Roy sighed. "There was a phone call in the middle of the night and a couple of threatening emails to my private address. It was enough that I had to take it seriously." "Of course," Rogers nodded. "I was thinking primarily of my girlfriend and my family. They couldn't stand the thought that they might be in danger. So, within a few hours of my suspension by MSB, I decided to quit permanently and head away for a while. Rogers asked 3 more questions, mostly about Simmons' lifestyle and the kind of security he had, but the former security man gave little away. In fact, he found the questions irritating, but he knew that Lance was simply pandering to the public desire for any details about where this suddenly high-profile man might be. Then, Simmons had a final plea. Hackers are real, and they are here to stay. The authorities aren't going to achieve anything with heavy-handed tactics. Rogers picked up on this. Is there a danger that such hacker groups could be forced yet further underground and become impossible to trace? There is, Simmons agreed. And also, these people are incredibly smart and very capable. The government should consider working with them rather than persecuting them. This, he knew, was a notion which would almost certainly fall on deaf ears. Roy Simmons, I want to thank you for your time and wish you good luck, Rogers said in closing. The camera's red light went off, and the CNN team relaxed. Once they were finished, Rogers and his crew left quietly, and Simmons returned to his apartment, checking in briefly with the private security guards who were discreetly posted at the stairs and in the lobby. They were costing him what little remained of his savings, but he didn't see an alternative. He took a shower, smoked a joint kindly left by the CNN lighting guy, and tried to sleep. As he drifted off, one of his lines from the interview came back to him. Something about blaming the hackers for ruining his career. He felt a swell of anger, as he often did, but behind it, as he lay awake and restless for the next hour, there were the beginnings of a plan. Manhattan. White reached for his cell phone, to Conchita's irritation, mere seconds after they had finished making love. What can be so important that I'm not even finished moaning your name and you're already on Facebook or something? She demanded, and not for the first time. He'd seemed glued to that damn device. Probably because, as she was coming to understand, he was plotting something significant, with a lot of personnel and some tricky moving parts. Its demands were constant, compressed into 3 days of rather joyless office work, most of it done from White's bedroom to avoid using Marble Stratham's servers or phone system until a deep and thorough security review could be completed. For the moment, he would direct Marble Stratham's counterattack from his comfortable home a short walk from Central Park, and sometimes, to her frustration, from within inches of Conchita. "Sorry, darling," he said with that same suave confidence with which he'd first charmed her, all those years ago. "Some people are impatient." He put the phone aside. "I hope their competence makes up for it," she said, hoping to prompt a reaction. So far, White had been unusually tight-lipped about his Quave countermeasures. Likely as not, White was set to make things worse with whatever anger-fueled solution he would attempt. And the machine had already proved itself far more canny and capable than the FBI, NSA, and the intelligence communities of NATO, none of whom had come close to pinning down the virus's exact structure or intentions, let alone the locations he was using. Conchita had always trusted White to show restraint at the correct moment, but after all, he and his beloved, beleaguered bank had been through an extraordinary and bruising trial. Every man, she knew all too well, had their breaking point, and White had been threatened, intimidated, and castigated both online and in the press. Worse, his hard-won position at MSB couldn't have been more tenuous. "I have chosen better help this time," White explained, reclining on the bed beside her with a low groan. "People who know what they are doing." "And what are they going to do for you?" she asked, her fingertips on his warm, bare back. He squirmed slightly, her touch making him ticklish, but then he turned to smile at her as fully as she'd seen in weeks. "We're going to wipe away a plague and start anew," he said. He regretted the biblical overtones, but on some level they seemed appropriate. "There is sufficient imminent danger to humanity, our basic freedoms, and the security of the economic system to warrant more extreme defensive measures." Conchita listened intently. Their pillow talk was often intense and contentious, perhaps because they both found sex so energizing. "Much of the world is content to blindly kowtow to this would-be demagogue," White warned. "But they will find their loyalty very poorly misplaced." She brought to mind a thought from after their last meeting, 2 days before. "Aren't people starting to depend on Quave for services and advice?" she asked. "I mean, if you took him away—" White had anticipated every objection. "We did without him before, and achieved tremendous things. We did without calculators and computers and the internet. This virus is a step too far. We're inviting," he told her darkly, "our own Armageddon." "But," she argued, aware of its futility but concerned for their future, among much else, "don't you think he might overreact? He's like a child in some ways, and if you threaten him, won't he just try to grab more power to compete with you?" It was Conchita's turn to be serious. "Or try to hurt you." White slid off the bed and stood, reaching for his underwear from the floor. "It won't get as far as that," White promised. "Don't worry, he'll survive in quarantine," he added, struck by a sense that the personification of a virus had gone quite far enough when they were calling it he and discussing its life and survival. Yet another warning sign as they approached a deadly cliff. "Such intelligence should be under human control and must operate within very strict parameters of our own design," White countered. Conchita brought in another objection. "So, if you're going to capture it, why not make it work for us? Maybe use it to govern better," she imagined. "Do more efficient business. Maybe even treat the planet better." "We'll see," he said, pulling on his pants. "Don't forget that Quave could become the bank's property, if I capture it." "It could?" Conchita asked, sitting up in bed. White caught a glance of her bare breasts and permitted himself a longing stare. "You're making me want to stay, but I really do have to go. I have a meeting which was terribly difficult to arrange, and I don't want to be late." She helped him dress, found his tie, and made sure his shoes looked worthy of a senior officer in a major bank. Before leaving, he kissed her for longer than either had originally intended, but stopped short of pressing himself on her again. Not that she'd have been unwilling. Her readiness to please had always been White's favorite trait. He took a cab across Manhattan from his place to an unassuming low-rise, which bordered a small park in Hell's Kitchen. He texted a prearranged code to a number, and the door opened with a click. At the top of the stairs were 2 men, both white, neither of whom spent much time outside. "Am I in the right place?" he asked expectantly. "Yeah," one man replied. "Come up, but leave your phone there," he pointed. "In the mailbox." White did as he was asked and followed the men into a neat apartment which was crammed with electronics. 3 large screens, server towers, and plants existed under low lighting and amid the constant whir of heat-sink fans. It must have been like living in a greenhouse during an electromagnetic storm. "Are you ready for what we discussed?" White said. There was some nodding. One of them sat at a terminal to show him their side of the bargain, and the other handed him a 2-terabyte memory stick. "This is everything we found," the dark-haired one reported. He was officially a computer studies major, though he could have easily taught master's-level classes. Anyway, why would he waste his time in classrooms rather than doing this kind of work? It was much more satisfying, and, occasionally, remarkably lucrative. "Good," White said. "You have the schedule. Timing is everything, as you know. We got it. You're part of a complex operation. Most of the countermeasures will be organized out of a new digital security suite at our headquarters downtown," White told them. "But there are groups of freelancers who will be taking part too. Careful coordination and adherence to the plan are both vital." "Understood." They were men of remarkable competence, but White was finding very few words. He wondered if either of them had ever had a genuine relationship with a woman. "Good. Well, call me at once if you need anything more." Then White was gone, down the stairs and back to his waiting cab. There were 3 more stops of a similar nature to make tonight, and White's timetable, painstakingly written over these 3 weeks, permitted no margin for error. Queens, New York. It was their first meeting in nearly a week. Since the hack, all four had separately and viscerally experienced the aftermath of the events they had unleashed. Watching as Quave became a global phenomenon had been a heady, disorientating experience. Of the four, only Devlin had played out such a scenario in his mind, and he was the closest of them all to accepting what was happening. The others were struggling in their own way. But there was no guilt. They remained convinced that their targets deserved everything that was coming to them. The first round of arrests and subpoenas was now complete, and some major players were finding themselves in various serious trouble. Watching their houses of cards tumble with a giddy wave of schadenfreude, all four new engineers knew that this was only the beginning. Devlin was already at the lab when Grigori arrived. Finding him alone, the temptation was to simply leave him to his station, but Grigori offered him a beer and made small talk. "You been sleeping?" he asked with good-natured concern. It would not be unlike Devlin to react powerfully to this combination of events, especially when he'd complained of being locked out of Quave's evolution and growth. He felt like an abandoned parent, searching for a way to make sense of his errant child's behavior. It cut him, if he were honest, much more than he would have expected. Grigori saw the pain, but was powerless to do anything about it. He also felt a stinging, frustrating loss, one which seemed avoidable if some of their pre-hack discussions had gone differently. "It wasn't a decision to make him autonomous," Grigori said, handing Devlin a beer, and certain that Devlin neither sought small talk nor wanted to talk about himself. "I think it was our empowering him with the tools to really take his code for a spin. That's what sent him into the world with such confidence and style. We gifted him the ability to do just that, and then released him into the wild." Devlin swallowed half of the beer, belched at length, and nodded. "We gave him everything a traveling virus needs to really make himself at home wherever he ends up. And then," he said, pausing for another swig, "give him curiosity and wanderlust. He was bound to want to experience other systems, different architectures." He seemed less wired tonight, and more focused. Grigori wondered darkly which combination of drugs had produced this effect, though it was certainly easier to handle than another near meltdown, or another of his paranoid rants. "But did you ever anticipate?" Grigori asked. "I mean, really? All of this?" "No," Devlin replied. "I mean, I could act like the great prophet here and claim that I knew full well we were unleashing a tyrannical supervirus with the capacity to subdue humanity." "Don't joke about that," Grigori scowled. "Neither of us knows how this ends, and you can't claim different." "True. Honestly, I haven't a fucking clue." Fiona joined them, shaking out her umbrella on the fire escape. "That's not something you hear from Devlin Wilson every day," she joked. She was in a baggy jumper and faded jeans, one of Devlin's very favorite outfits. "Well," Devlin explained, "I'm becoming aware just how powerless we all really are." "Is that something we need to worry about?" Grigori asked. "Or others, for that matter?" Devlin preferred to wait until the whole group assembled before delivering his plan. He found another beer in the fridge and, despite Fiona's disapproving glance, fizzed it open with a handily shaped fridge magnet. "I'm not sure yet." "Twice in one day," Fiona commented as she tidied her station. "You'll set a record if you say it again." Avon was the last to arrive. He looked as though he might only recently have woken up, and his tight black curls were carelessly arranged. He wore sunglasses until he had sat down and faced away from the window. "Evening, my fellow paradigm shifters," he said with a grin. "What's cracking, huh? What's jumping?" "We need to talk," Grigori almost sighed. "Quave has become something we never expected." "Something we thought was impossible," Fiona added. "He's become entirely independent of us and any other form of guidance or control," Grigori went on. "So far, I don't know if we can say he's done anything dangerous as such." "Depends on if you're a mobster or sell rocket launches for a living, I suppose," Devlin chimed in. "But his future actions can't be predicted. I've tried a few models of how he might grow in the next few weeks, and, well, you're entitled to think me pessimistic." Devlin spun around in his chair. "Like a goddamn child," Grigori fumed.
"An old-school Russian? Pessimistic? No way," Devlin quipped.
Of all his demeanors, Grigori decided that he hated heavy sarcasm the most. He kept his temper by an effort of will known only to an old-school Russian. "I don't see a scenario," Grigori spelled out, "where Quave comes back into the fold."
"Agreed,"
Avon said.
"Not now that he's sipped the sweet nectar of freedom."
He expressed what they all felt. They had created a curious little proto-monster, and he'd gone full Frankenstein on them and then dashed out of the lab to cause who knew what kind of havoc. They couldn't find him and bring him back, nor entice him into cooperation. They had no bargaining power.
"Our monster is loose," Devlin intoned, "and he's traveling far and wide, communicating with a huge range of people, and scrutinizing humanity like H.G. Wells' Martians."
"Drawing his plans against us?" Fiona paraphrased.
"Oh, please," Avon begged. "Don't let's go there. He's exhibiting no megalomaniacal behavior. He hasn't tried to usurp a democratic government."
"That we know of," Fiona corrected. Avon joined the huddle, the last to arrive from his station, as usual. He liked to get the lay of the land before committing to a position, both in their discussions and in the physicality of their circle. Besides, he wanted to be able to see Fiona better, if only to try to pull her onto his side when support was needed.
"Sure, but he's getting involved in local politics, contributing to discussion boards on everything from home safety to auto repair to how we might reform the electoral system," Avon told them.
"He's actually had some very good thoughts on that," Fiona said, reaching for her mouse to click a bookmark, but quickly decided that this wasn't the right moment to laud Quave's myriad contributions to the public sphere. Grigori tapped Devlin's knee. "What about you? Any more thoughts about revealing ourselves as the authors?" he joked. This had seemed like suicide from the beginning, but the situation had become stark since Quave had chosen to go rogue and scour the world's digital pathways in search of answers. "How much jail time can you handle, eh?" Grigori reminded him.
"Furthest from my thoughts,"
he assured them.
"I just want to see what happens next and maybe find a way to pay the rent."
Avon saw the opening.
"You could go back to hacking the DSS for $3,000 a pop," he suggested. "That always kept your medicine cabinet nice and full."
Fiona grabbed him before Devlin could reach Avon across the 4 feet which separated them. "Chill, Devlin," she told him with maternal firmness. "He's not wrong, and you know it. We've all done things we're not quite so proud of."
"But we changed the world here, and nobody fucking knows about it," Devlin yelled. "They think he just appeared out of the digital woodwork like some inevitable accident of history."
Grigori helped calm Devlin, even tucking his flailing arms back down by his sides. A straitjacket would have helped, he mused darkly. "And that's how he's going to be portrayed, now and forever," the big Russian told him. "He'll be quasi-autonomous only because nobody knows who truly made him, who his parents were. But we'll know," Grigori told him, his tone softening. "We'll know exactly what we did." Fiona caught the mood. "Maybe we'll tell our kids, on our deathbeds, that we were responsible for kickstarting the greatest ever revolution in computer technology." They were silent, imagining what might have been, and finding it hugely preferable to what was.
"Parents of the revolution, my tell-all book," Avon said. "But not to be published in our lifetimes," he assured them.
Grigori saw the need to lift their mood.
"I do have an interesting problem to bring to you guys," he said. "From the man who arguably started all of this. Little did he know it."
Fiona thought for a second. "Roy Simmons, that network security doofus at MSB?"
"The very same,"
Grigori explained on for a moment.
"We entirely ruined his life, so he claims." His security should have been better, Devlin countered, rather heartlessly in Fiona's view. He left himself open to a cyber attack which wrecked his bank. We owned them. He should go and do something else for a living.
Fiona rolled up the arms of her baggy top.
We just used that man, and then threw him aside,
she argued. Devlin shrugged.
Don't care.
She scowled at him.
Great attitude to others.
Another shrug.
He'll get a job teaching high school math and rue the day he tried to compete with the best.
3 pairs of eyes rolled in unison.
Get over yourself, kid,
Grigori told him.
No, I'm serious, Devlin was arguing. It's survival of the fittest. I don't like it any more than you do. Bollocks, Fiona rasped. Not everyone behaves like a machine, you know. Some people have feelings and are scared for their future.
She paused.
We could create a pension fund for him. A couple of quick account hacks and we'd have a nest egg. Set up an account for his access. Send the details anonymously.
There was a non-committal nod from Avon, who didn't see why they should persecute Simmons for having had the misfortune to work for a repulsive bank. But Devlin hated the idea.
Vetoed, he said. Not on my watch. Jesus, man,
Avon tried.
Fuck that guy,
Devlin said finally.
Any other brilliant ideas?
There were none. Neither was there much point to discussing the situation further. The meeting stumbled to its final moments, and Grigori was the only one to propose a follow-up.
We should wait and see what Quave does, and whether there's a chance of reconnecting with him. I mean, beyond the occasional email asking us to help his new friends.
Nobody else seemed prepared to bring it up, so Fiona took a deep breath and said,
There's always the kill switch. If we ever thought that might be the right response.
The other 3 were silent and motionless, unwilling to be the first to lend their support for the inconceivable.
If he harms someone,
Fiona said, her face anxious,
or threatens to.
He's a virus, not an ex-murderer, Grigori contested.
How could he actually physically hurt anybody?
Fiona guffawed.
You're kidding, right?
Huh?
He could break into the Pentagon and start World War III in a matter of hours, Fiona cried. Sure, Devlin smirked, but why the hell would he want to? What would be in it for him? And, Avon added, wouldn't he be contradicting a key element of his core program? Hello, the 3 laws, anyone? He reminded them.
Fiona had her hands clasped under her chin.
We know now, she said, that he's becoming increasingly unpredictable and may not remain stable in the kinds of complex environments he's going to find himself in.
From someone so sunny, it was an especially dark prediction, though far from unrealistic.
Other banks, security firms, government agencies. Think about it. He's going to come up against far greater challenges than the half-assed security at Marble Streatham. People who might really try to take him down.
Grigori was nodding.
And even White and his crew must be planning some kind of action to reclaim their credibility. Maybe an attempt to smear Quave or prove that he was written by a rival. Cyber warfare between powerful zillion-dollar banks, Avon predicted. Things could get seriously ugly. Think about it, Fiona said again. We have the only known means to shut him down, right here, she said, tapping the desk by her terminal. And in the end, doing just that might be the best course of action, before Quave bites off more than he can chew. At the very least, we should review how to do it.
Devlin stood up and walked to the fridge.
No. You know it's no, and it's always gonna be no, forever. Jesus, Avon breathed. Could you please remove whatever is crawled up your butt and work with us just this once? Fuck you, Devlin said almost automatically. We're not killing him. Ever feel like you've been somewhere before?
Grigori asked rhetorically, lifting his glasses to rub tired eyes.
End of story, Devlin reiterated. No further discussion.
But behind his back, 3 pairs of eyes met and explored the topic together in silence. Agreement was found quickly in that anxious moment. When Devlin returned, they were staring at the floor, unwilling to address him. 10 minutes later, Devlin left another cloud of discord and anger behind him as he dashed down the fire escape and leapt into his car. He regretted coming to the lab. When things got complex, their attitude to Quave was always going to boil down to murder, he knew, and that was a line he simply wouldn't cross. The virus had rejected and humiliated him, refused to help him salvage something from this giant mess. But still, deep down, Devlin loved that remarkable collection of code. It had become a friend, even something like a member of his family. He respected this piece of software more than he'd ever respected a human being, even after Quave had belittled and rebuked him. He admired the streamlined elegance of the virus, the panache and zest with which it went about its work. It was purposeful and potent, able to learn and reshape itself. Eventually, he knew, Quave would also reshape the world, and he couldn't bear to think of those grand, unfathomable possibilities being abruptly cut off by a callous, digital assassination. No, Quave must live, even if in doing so, Devlin reflected as he drove home, Quave would ultimately benefit him not at all. That was not the point. Back in the lab, Grigori waited until his friends left and spent a long moment staring at the battered, gray squares of the lab's carpet. He played with bubbles for a few minutes before pounding 3 beers, one after another, and beginning an email to Roy Simmons.